Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man. So as you guys know, we do have the Grand Prix, the FIDE Grand Prix going on. So we do have Pentala Harikrishna versus Wesley. And I forgot to check where Pentala Harikrishna is from exactly in India. But I will say namaste to you guys. If he is from where they speak Tamil, I will say Vanakam or Danyavadalu. Namaskaram. Namaskaram. Okay. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. As always, my people in the Philippines, I would say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan. Mabuting pagbati ingat lagi. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. And I will say the phrase that I recently learned. Mugging the killer. Okay. I just learned how to say that right. Shout out to my guy Ronaldo. Appreciate you, buddy. All right, man. So we do have, like I said, round two. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. All right, so we got e4, e5, knight to f3, got knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6. And so we do have the Ruy Lopez, also known as the Spanish game, and it is the Berlin defense. As you guys know, Vladimir Kramnik played it very successfully against Garry Kasparov in their 2000 match. So it is also known as the Berlin Wall. We do have castles by white. Knight takes e4. But as you guys always probably know, this is not giving away a pawn because you are going to be getting it back very quickly. We do see rook over to e1. Knight comes back to d6, attacking the bishop. We do see a4, just a way to defend the bishop. We got bishop to e7. We really want to make sure as black that we're covering this file because this rook and this knight are both trained to, deliver some tactics. We definitely don't want any knight grabbing and then knight discovery checks going on. So bishop to e7 just takes care of that. We do see knight to c3. We're not in any hurry to take this pawn. And there really isn't a good way, for black to hold on to it because you definitely don't want to go f6 because d4 is going to come. And you are opening up this diagonal. This diagonal right there. Bam! Can I get the arrows right? And the queen definitely can pop on the h5. So we do have a6. Bishop comes back to f1, preserving the bishop. We see e4. Like I said, there wasn't a way to hold on to the pawn, so you're just kind of choosing, the way that you want to get rid of it. And by making the other knight capture. So knight takes on e4. Knight takes e4. Rook takes e4. We do have d5. Giving a nice little attack, a nice little tempo attack on the rook on e4. We see the rook coming back down to e1. Bishop comes to g4, h3. Bishop comes back to h5. We got bishop to e2. That way our knight can move. We got castles by black. Always a great idea to castle your pieces. You don't want to get stuck in the center of the board because then that's how you get the game of the century played against you. Congratulations for all those that caught that reference. That Donald Byrne versus Bobby Fischer game. We do have d4. Bishop comes to d6. The bishop is not so bad on e7, but it is a little bit better on d6. It is, attacking this diagonal. And it's never a bad idea to have, pieces kind of attacking these squares in front of your opponent's king. So bishop comes to d6. We see knight up to e5. And this is, discovering an attack on this undefended bishop. So black takes care of that by going bishop takes e2. We see rook takes e2, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5. We got bishop back to e7, and then we have rook over to d2. It's always good to put a rook opposite, a queen or a king, as I always say. So we're just attacking this under-defended pawn for the moment. So we do have c6 just taking care of that. It's also opening up this diagonal for this bishop to come on. So we do have c4. And something kind of has to give here because if not, you're just going to be winning a pawn. So the queen does come to a5. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, and then you do have rook to d3. Some of you guys might be wondering, why don't you just take the pawn immediately? Because it seems like you can. I mean, it's not too bad of a thing to take it immediately, but moving rook to d3 first is just being a little bit more patient. It's also allowing your bishop to come out into play because in this position that we have here, we are a little bit underdeveloped for white. We have this bishop and this rook that aren't fully in the game yet, and black has kind of done all they needed to do with their pieces and got their rooks connected. So, you know, black is just a little bit further ahead. So you want to make sure, you know, that you're not behind. So that is the reasoning behind this move. Rook comes to d3. We see rook f to d8. We got bishop up to e3. Rook a to c8. We see queen to b3. We have queen down to b4. Queen takes b4. Bishop takes b4. We have rook a to d1. And white is in a very, very strong position. As you guys can see, there isn't a great way to really defend this pawn. So it is going to be dropping off the board. You know, you can't really put a rook here to kind of side defend it. You don't have time to double the rooks. So, I mean, white is just in a very dominant position at this point in the game. So they will be up a pawn. We see king over to f8. And then we have actually reached a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see what really beautiful move white has the ability to play, go ahead and do so. Okay, so what we actually saw in the game was rook takes d5. Rook takes d5 is just slightly too hasty. The thing that you want to have, the thing that you want to be paying attention to, you know, when you're playing your games is you built up a position, you're about to snag a pawn or something like that off the board, but you want to always think like, do I have to snap it off immediately right now? Like, can I wait? Can I make another move that gets me in a better position before I do so? Because, I mean, if it's going to take many moves for your opponent to, you know, defend a piece and it's just primed for the taking, you don't have to be in a rush. So, you know, be patient. So something that can actually be played into position instead of immediately taking the pawn on d5 is actually bishop to b6. And there is a super good reason why bishop to b6 can be played. You are getting a counterattack on this rook, but more importantly, you're freeing the bishop up and it's much better placed on b6. And I will show you exactly why in a minute. I'm going to come back to this. But in the game, this is what we actually saw. Rook took d5, rook took d5, rook took d5. And then we do see king down to e7. The king is getting in a pretty dominant position. So we actually see rook down to d4 attacking the bishop, but we have the ability to play a5 in this position. As you guys can see, this bishop is blocked on this diagonal. So it's not the most beneficial position for the bishop to be in. So when I come back to what I was saying before, after we saw bishop to b6, now black has to decide like what they're going to do with their rook. And I mean, pretty much the only thing that you can really do is go rook to d7 because that's the only thing that even gives some type of a fight for this pawn. But as you guys will notice, this position is definitely much different than the other position because you don't have that bishop blocked. So after we see rook down to d7, rook would come up to d4 and attack this bishop. And you actually don't have the ability to go a5 in this one because after the rooks get exchanged, you are double attacking this pawn and you just are allowing too much infiltration in here with this rook. And so you're going to get, not only are you down a pawn, but you're going to get in a much worse position. And as you guys can see, that is the major difference between that bishop being out and the bishop being stuck on e3. But going back to what we had in the game, we did see king up to e7. We see rook down to d4, and then we see a5, and then the rook comes over to h4. The problem is, like, you know, you're not really super attacking the king side because, I mean, it's just easily defendable. You have h6, and then after the rook comes over to g4, you actually see the king going back to f8. I mean, you can... It's probably not the best to go g5 because you can see h4 coming and you're kind of breaking the structure down. So the king comes back to f8. But there aren't a lot of pieces on the board. So, I mean, you're doing pretty well. So the king comes over to f1. We see rook down to c2. And this is the major killer here. Because black was in such a defensive position before. This rook lift, you know, to the 7th rank, it was not as possible because you were going to be losing some material as black. But in this particular case, you do have the ability to do it. So as you guys can see, this rook, this king, is a lot more cut off than it was before. So we see b3. We see bishop up to c5. Rook comes to e4. We see bishop takes e3. Rook takes e3. And so everything is defended. You know, white is up the full pawn. But, I mean, you guys are going to see that this king is going to be a little bit too active. The king comes down to e7. We see f4. We got G6, just making sure we prevent, you know, what white is trying to do on the king side. The rook comes to D3, we see B5. Pawn takes B5, rook takes C5, we see king up to F2. We see rook taking B5, king up to F3. We see H5. We got G4, pawn takes G4, pawn takes G4. We got king down to E6. We got king over to G3. We see G5, pawn takes G5, rook takes E5. And you guys can see that we're pretty much hoovering everything off the board. The king comes up to H4. The king comes up to E6. We see rook to F3, rook down to E4. We got G6, pawn takes G6, king to G5. We see A4, pawn takes A4, rook takes A4, and then we see king up to G6. And it is actually in this position that the players agree to a draw. And it is super drawn just simply because the next move that's going to be coming on the board is rook takes G4 with check. And as you guys can see, it's a king and a rook versus a king and a rook. And I mean, there really isn't any progress to be made. I mean, basically, the only way that you have a chance to win is if one of the sides actually allows themselves to be checkmated on purpose. Because, I mean, it's just completely equal material. But in this particular position, after the rook takes on A4, you might be kind of thinking, well, instead of moving my king away, why don't I just play something like that? The problem is, if you did play something like rook to F6, black would actually be able to deflect your king away from the protection of this rook. And you're pretty much going to get into a draw anyway. So if we kind of see what that looks like, after the rook comes up to F6, you're thinking maybe I'm just going to swing over and grab this pawn. You would actually see rook taking G4 with check, and then the king would take. The king would take on F6. And yes, you are up a pawn as black, but you are in a completely drawn endgame. Just to give you guys kind of like the most direct path that you can go and draw this endgame, it would be king over to F4. Something that you want to be paying attention to when you're in an endgame, king and a pawn versus a king, is always try to maintain opposition. And if you do have to retreat, normally you want to retreat back in front of the pawn. You don't want to try to leave off on either side, you know, because then you're going to allow your opponent usually some tempi, and they're probably going to be able to convert it into a winning position. There's a very thin line between a win and a loss in these positions. But, you know, if we see the pawn going down to G5 with check, the king would come down to F3, king to F5, king goes over to G3. So you're pretty much going between the F and the G files here. You don't really want to step over to the H file because you're going to be getting kind of pinned over in the corner. So the pawn coming up to G4, king down to G2. Like I said, retreat directly back. The king comes down to F4, and then you're grabbing the opposition, king to F2. Pawn goes to G3 with check, king goes to G2, king goes to G4, king goes directly back to G1. King comes to F3, king goes over to F1, and then you have the pawn push, the king goes to G1, king goes to G3. There really isn't much better than this in this particular position. So, I mean, you still would have drawn the game, but, you know, it's just a little different. But, you know, the technique really comes into play, you know, when you're getting into these end games. So that is that game from round 2. I will be covering round 3 tomorrow, but I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Danyavadalu or Danyavad for anybody, or Nandri for anybody coming from India. And Meraming Salamat Aking Makaibigan. And like I said, Maging Dakila. Thank you guys very much for stopping by, and I'll see y'all next time.